The ancient Near East was the world of the Bible. At the heart of that world lived the ancient Israelite people in countries which we now call Israel, Palestine, and Jordan. And this is where we're going to look closely at the site of a biblical town. The town was probably the biblical Mitzpah of Benjamin and is located 8 miles north of Jerusalem. We'll visit this ancient town in order to learn about an archaeological excavation and also to discover something about daily life 3,000 years ago. The excavation of the town was directed by Dr. William F. Bade, who was a professor of Old Testament and Semitic languages at Pacific School of Religion in Berkeley, California from 1902 until his death in 1936. His years as a biblical scholar led him naturally to an interest in archaeology, and it was his great desire to go to the Holy Land and excavate a site. At the end of World War I, when Palestine became a British mandate, archaeologists were permitted to enter the area and work under the regulation of a Department of Antiquities established to protect historic sites. Arriving in Jerusalem in 1926, Dr. Bade drove north to a low hill that bore the Arabic name Tel el-Nasbeh, meaning Mound of the Pillar. This was the location suggested by some scholars as the town of Mitzpah, mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Thousands of these tells, or mounds, are found throughout the Near East. Beneath them lie buried the remains of ancient civilizations, built up over the centuries in alternating layers of occupation and destruction. In his notes, Dr. Bade wrote, "The mound is plainly visible for a long distance, for it's prominent on the landscape. A wall can be seen on one side, and it's quite clear that it's the ruin of an ancient fortified city." He made the decision to excavate the site, which has been abandoned for centuries, and it did it in 5 campaigns of several months each between the years 1926 and 1935. The permit to dig was granted to the Pacific School of Religion, and Dr. Bade was made director. Before digging could begin, Dr. Bade had to rent the land from the Arab farmers who owned it. He purchased tools and equipment, arranged for housing for the staff, and hired local Arab laborers, men to dig, and women and boys to carry away the dirt. Egyptian foremen were in charge of the workforce, and the staff included a surveyor, photographer, recorder, and draftsman. The first work at the Tell was done by the surveyor, whose map of the entire area was marked in 10-meter squares. As each square was excavated, the finds were photographed and recorded. Hoes and picks, pictured here in the left and right foreground, were used for the initial digging. Finer work, some of it inside tombs, required the use of smaller tools, such as tiny picks and brushes. Pottery pieces uncovered in the digging were collected in baskets for further study. The task of washing and sorting the thousands of broken pieces seemed endless. When possible, these potsherds were glued together in order to reconstruct the ancient vessel. An accurate record was kept of the location in which each artifact was found. Objects of the greatest archaeological significance were drawn and assigned museum numbers. These scientific excavation techniques, some of which were pioneered by Dr. Bade, were set forth in his book, A Manual of Excavation in the Near East. A selection of artifacts was kept by the Department of Antiquities in Palestine, but Dr. Bade was permitted to bring back a great many to the Pacific School of Religion. These form the nucleus of the collection of the Bade Museum of Biblical Archaeology. Publication of the excavation results, delayed by Dr. Bade's death, was accomplished in 1947 under the direction of Dr. C.C. McCowan, professor of New Testament Studies at Pacific School of Religion and a skilled archaeologist in his own right. What was learned by Dr. Bade and his staff as they dug in the soil of the Holy Land? And what can we learn from the excavation of this ancient town? First, the periods of occupation of the city were determined. The excavation of nearby graves revealed ceramics that dated to the early Bronze Age, about 3000 BC. The contents of other tombs showed that the area was settled to a limited extent in Hellenistic and Roman times, and then on to the Byzantine period. Thus, the archaeological evidence indicated that the site had been occupied at various periods between 3000 BC and 600 AD. However, most of the ceramics and artifacts found date to the Iron Age in Palestine, from about 1200 BC to 586 BC, the time of Israelite settlement and of the united and divided monarchies. The first Israelite settlement at the site is believed to date from around 1100 BC. At the time of the divided kingdom, after Solomon's death, the town was fortified and prospered until the Babylonians conquered the region. Second, a great deal was learned about life in a fortified town from the period 900 to 586 BC, and the remainder of the slides will concentrate on this subject. The most outstanding feature of the town was its strong defenses, consisting primarily of a huge wall. In this artist's conception, based on the excavation results, we see how the town may have looked to approaching travelers in the 9th century BC. The original height of the wall may have been as much as 40 feet, and defensive towers were built as varying intervals along it. Sloping stone facings, or revetments, at the base of the towers protected them from battering rams of the enemy. The wall circled the town completely, as may be seen in this aerial photograph of the top of the 8-acre mound. On this drawing, made after the completion of the excavation, the wall is the brown oval line. After digging only a few feet in the soil, workers came to the ruins of the town wall. Although it was no longer standing to its original height, it was still an impressive structure. The lower portion of the outside of the wall has been covered with lime plaster in order to make climbing more difficult for the enemy. Excavation revealed some of the plaster still intact. The wall varied in thickness from 15 to 20 feet and was built of the abundant native limestone of the area, held together by clay mortar. If the town is indeed Mitzpah, then these are the walls referred to in 1 Kings 15:22, which states, "Then King Asa made a proclamation to all Judah. None was exempt, and they carried away the stones of Ramah and its timber, with which Baasha had been building. And with them King Asa built Geba of Benjamin and Mitzpah." It was important to fortify the town because of its strategic location on the border between Israel and Judah, and its proximity to Jerusalem, the capital of Judah, the southern kingdom. The circling wall had to be provided with a gateway, in this case located to the northeast and strongly fortified. This model shows the foundations of the gateway at Tel en-Nasbeh. When the town was occupied, the walls would have risen higher, and the gateway itself may have been roofed. The gate was cleverly placed between the overlapping ends of the town wall. On the left was a large defensive tower, and 2 guard rooms were constructed so that persons entering the gate could be observed by the guards. Wooden doors probably closed at the threshold. The slaughter groove in the tower marks the location of a bar that could have been placed behind the doors when they were closed, providing greater security. The area immediately outside the doors, between the ends of the walls, was paved and drained, and stone benches lined the sides. This area, in peacetime at least, was the center of the town's community life, where both the marketplace and law courts were held. Numerous references in the Hebrew Bible bear out the importance of the gate area. Business and property transactions took place at the gate, as in Ruth chapter 4, for example. Just as in the model, here's the stone threshold in the foreground, the passageway into the city, and one of the guard rooms. These guard rooms were located just inside the doors of the gate. Here we can imagine the elders of the town sitting and pronouncing judgment on persons who had done wrong, as mentioned in Deuteronomy 17:5, 21:19, and 25:7. Discovery of weights marked Pim at this and other sites enable biblical scholars to translate 1 Samuel 13:19 through 21 correctly. The town walls were not the only means of defense available to the inhabitants of Mitzpah. Heavy rounded stones were thrown from a sling that was whirled around above the slinger's head. Judges 20:16 describe the effectiveness of these weapons, not only in hunting but in battle as well. This well-shaped bronze arrowhead was one of many points of spears and arrows found. The bow has been known since prehistoric times. The struggle to protect themselves from their enemies and to provide for the necessities of life dominated the lives of most peoples in ancient times, and the Israelites in this town were no exception. Their economy was based on agriculture and supplemented with the flocks of sheep and goats they kept. Each day, when the city gates were opened and shepherds let their flocks out to search for pasture, others went to tend fields, vineyards, orchards, and olive groves. Among the iron implements used in farming were the sickle blade and plow point. This drawing shows how the plow point was fitted to pieces of wood and dragged through the shallow, rocky soil to prepare it for planting. Although the Israelites used iron tools, there were at first no iron workers among them. The Philistines, pieces of whose painted ceramics were found at Tel el-Nasbeh, had a monopoly on ironworking for many years, and the Israelites were dependent on them, even for sharpening and repairs. The Philistines were an Aegean people, often referred to as people of the sea, who settled on the coast of Palestine after they had been repulsed in their attempt to invade Egypt. At about the same time, around 1200 BC, the Israelite tribes were settling the interior of the land. There was much fighting between groups until the Philistines were subdued by King David about 1000 BC and largely confined to the coastal region. Ironically, the name Palestine, meaning land of the Philistines, was applied by the Romans to the entire country. The wheat and barley planted and harvested by means of those iron implements was stored in stone silos built inside the town walls. Large ceramic jars also preserved the grain until it was needed for food. The saddle quern and muller were used to grind grain into flour for baking. It's not unusual for small amounts of food to be found in excavations. These raisins from Tel el-Nasbeh and wheat grains from Jericho were preserved by fires that carbonized rather than consumed them. Grapes were made into wine as well as raisins. In this stone press, the juice was trampled from the grapes at the beginning of the winemaking process. In the foreground is the vat, hollowed from stone into which the juice ran. Later, it may have been stored in jars of this kind until it was ready for drinking. Other crops included olives, lentils, cucumbers, beans, onions, garlic, figs, melons, and even pomegranates. Milk and its products were available from the flocks, but meat was usually reserved for festival occasions. Honey, spices, and salt were also common. Most cooking was done by boiling. Cooking pots were placed directly on the fire, and these examples have obviously been blackened from long use. The water supply was of constant concern in ancient settlements, and the spring outside of the wall at Tel el-Nasbeh sometimes ran dry during the long rainless summers. Cisterns were dug to catch the winter rains as they drained from roofs and streets. The opening to a cistern is on the left of this picture. The channel that leads into it runs across the center. Lime plaster was applied to the inside of cisterns in order to make them more waterproof. Such provisions for storage of food and water were normal for daily life and would also have enabled the town to withstand a siege for some time. Remains of the house walls appear in this general view of the excavation. The town didn't have a regular plan, and the houses, most of which only had 4 ground floor rooms, were built close together. An excellent example of the typical Iron Age 4-room house, built of limestone blocks, was found just inside the town gate. The pillars, which are still standing, were probably the roof supports. This building was used as the basis for this model, which shows how houses may have looked. The rooms are built around an open courtyard, and an outside staircase leads to the roof, which has a guardrail around it in compliance with the safety law laid down in Deuteronomy 22:8. The roof was probably made of reeds and matted thorns, placed on crossbeams and covered with clay, a construction that would have been fairly watertight. Although the model doesn't show it, this type of house may have had a second story for living quarters, with the enclosed part of the lower floor serving as storerooms and stable areas. Household objects were made of clay, and ceramics are the single most common item turned up in excavations. No furniture was found. Probably these people were not prosperous enough to even have the simple wooden chairs and tables, of which few remains survive in the damp soil of the region. References in the Hebrew Bible to the potter's house indicate that ceramics were made commercially, but they were also produced by individual households. Most of the ceramics are well-shaped but utilitarian. There's little in the way of decoration except for the application of a red slip of iron-rich clay on some pieces. Other pieces have been burnished or rubbed as they were turned on the wheel, producing a pattern of rings as seen in this bowl. The potter's wheel, a part of which is shown on the right, was used in this region as early as 2000 BC, and the remains of a pottery kiln were uncovered at Tel el-Nasbe. The clay pieces excavated include large jars for storing grain, wine, and oil, cooking pots, bowls, cups, lamps, spindle whorls, figurines, and cult objects. An interesting piece of household equipment made of clay was the footbath, much used in Near Eastern hospitality. The practice of providing water to bathe the hot, dusty feet of travelers is mentioned frequently in the Bible. A necessity for every home was the clay saucer lamp. Its wick was made of flax fibers, and the oil burned in the lamps was pressed from olives. This basic form of lamp was used during the entire period of the Hebrew Bible. A base was often added during the 9th century BC, as seen with the lamp on the right, and the shape modified to a more folded style during the 5th century BC, as with the lamp on the left. The small black juglet was used to pour oil into the lamps. Even evidence of writing can be found on clay. The early Hebrew letters found on this jar handle were made when a seal was pressed onto it before the clay hardened. Broken pieces of pottery, which archaeologists call sherds, abounded, and even these were not wasted by the ancient Israelites. The sherds could be used to scoop up ashes from the hearth, or water from a pit, or ground up for mortar. Writing was often done directly on them with a rush pen, and ink that was made from lamp soot and tree gum. All traces of textiles have disappeared because of decay, but excavation revealed many clay or stone spindle whorls and loom weights, reminders of the hours spent spinning and weaving to produce clothing. The raw materials were wool from sheep and fibers of the flax plant, of which linen cloth was made. Evidence of olive oil manufacturing was uncovered in several areas in the form of presses. The circular channel cut around the rim of the stone vat connects with its inner chamber so that none of the precious oil was lost as it was squeezed from the olives. Two different types of pins were used to fasten clothing. The fibula, which looks much like a modern safety pin, came into use about the 10th century BC in Palestine. The toggle pin, used earlier, had a hole near one end through which a cord was tied. The pin was inserted into the cloth and held in place by a winging cord over the protruding ends. The different pins may indicate that there was a change in clothing styles. Some jewelry was found in the tombs, although tomb robbers may have carried off the better pieces, especially those made of gold. Jewelry included bronze rings, earrings, anklets, and bracelets. Beads were made of stone, painted pottery, carnelian, and even glass. It's obvious that this culture had neither the wealth nor the leisure time to produce the fine work of the Egyptians, for example. Jewelry may have been more than merely decorative. These amulets, carved from animal bone, were worn for their presumed ability to ward off evil and bring good health and strength. Decoration of one's person was just as popular in ancient times as it is today, and archaeology reveals evidence of the use of eye makeup by the Israelites. Mineral substances were powdered in cosmetic mortars, such as the one on the left, to produce the desired colors. Manganese, or antimony, furnished the black for eyebrows and lashes, while malachite or turquoise, the green and gray for lids, and red ochre for lip coloring. Bone or bronze cosmetic spoons were the applicators. The tweezer looks quite modern. On the right is a juglet imported from Cyprus to hold perfume or ointment. While the relationship between the Israelite people and their God was the central theme of the Hebrew Bible, archaeology has been able to provide very little direct evidence on this point. On the contrary, these fragments of figurines of a Canaanite goddess remind us that the worship of Yahweh was threatened by the existence of other gods. These 6-inch tall household items with exaggerated female features are of two types. The figurine on the right was made in one piece with a face formed by pinching. On the left is the pillar base formed by one hand and the head made separately in a mold, thus making it easily broken from the body. Worship of this goddess and others was widespread throughout the Near East. The archaeologist pursues the study of ancient peoples even into their tombs, which reveal information about burial customs and also frequently contain fine examples of artifacts. The tombs of Tel el-Nasbe were of the cave variety, either naturally occurring or cut into the rocky hillside outside the walls of the town. A flight of steps led down into a rectangular room, around the sides of which were ledges where the bodies of the deceased were placed. Behind this room was another where bones of older burials were deposited. This tomb was used for several centuries, probably by one family. On the floor of the tomb, pottery, which has been buried with the dead, lies scattered about just as it was left by an ancient tomb robber searching for gold and jewelry. Tomb 32, shown here in the process of excavation, was the richest of the graves. It contained nearly 1,000 objects, a vast variety of vessels, jewelry, seals, and scarabs, as well as much broken pottery. The seal of Jazaniah, one of the most important small finds at Tel el-Nasbe, came from a tomb. The seal was made of striated black and white agate, shaped so that the rounded top would have the appearance of an eye with a black pupil. Thus it may have also served as an amulet, which the owner thought would protect him from harm. The impression made from the seal enables us to see that it was inscribed with 6th century BC Hebrew letters that read, "Belonging to Jazaniah, officer of the king." Below the lettering is an excellent engraving of the fighting cock, one of the earliest representations of this animal known in Palestine. The name Jazaniah is mentioned several times in the Hebrew Bible, and in 2 Kings 25:23, it's associated specifically with the city of Mitzpah during this period, immediately following the destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. There's something very personal about this little seal, no bigger than a thumbnail. It bears on it the name of the man who wore it, a man who must have lived 2,500 years ago, and who may have died at the very site excavated by Dr. Bade. Through the work of archaeologists, we're drawn closer to these ancient peoples, and by seeing the remains of their settlements and the objects they made, we can perceive them as persons with the same needs and emotions we have today.